Welcome to the Radical Lifestyle Podcast, brought to you by Generation to Generation, where you will be inspired by the past, equipped for the present, and prepared for the future as we engage in conversations with people from around the world. Hello everyone, this is Andrew and Daphne from Generation to Generation, and our guest today is Jake Mahal. Jake, for people that don't know who you are, can you just say a bit about where you're from and what you do? And for people that can't see him, he has a spectacular beard like myself, so we like him even more for that.
Hey, so good to be with you today. Like Andrew said, my name's Jake, and I live and have lived most of my life in Stafford, in the middle of England, and married to Freya, 2 kids, Rufus and Matilda, and a dog called Bear, and 8 chickens living in the garden. That kind of makes up our household. And so I spend my time in a number of different ways. So I lead intergenerational mission teams, predominantly in Southeast Asia. Spent a lot of time out in the Philippines, doing development work there, working with impoverished communities, trying to help them to help themselves, get themselves out of poverty, out, up on their feet, look at social enterprises, land management, installing good sanitation, just all sorts of different things. And you kind of, you have to skill up constantly as you're going along doing that. So I find myself with a kind of weird CV from all of that stuff. And then also a bit of web design and business management. My wife and I run antenatal classes. She's a midwife, so she does all the teaching. I do all the back end stuff for that. And that's great because we get to get really close to families at their, at the start of their family life. And Freya just has this amazing influence into families' lives. She has this kind of anointing where people open up to her and just want to tell her everything. And people come back to her year after year for life advice. And she's like, oh, I don't know. I'm not an expert in that, but, she listens to Holy Spirit and she just has this amazing way of influencing people. So that's a lot of fun. Involved with stuff with Youth with a Mission, various kind of family events and children and youth events. Life is quite varied. I get pulled into doing lots of different things, and like you guys, I just tend to say yes to things when I get invited.
Sounds good. And for people listening to this and they think this Jake sounds like an interesting character, and if they're listening to this on audio, they might want to actually see your beard. So where can they see that? Where can they see some of the videos that you're putting up there, especially around the topic we're going to talk about, which is self-sustainability? But where can they do that?
Sure.
Or even your wife's business, where can they find out about that as well?
Yeah, so that's expectingclasses.co.uk. So if you are expecting, or you're expecting, or at some point you are going to be expecting a baby, then expectingclasses.co.uk. It's a great place to find out more info, to kind of equip you for pregnancy, labour, birth, early parenting. And we have an online course, so no matter where you are in the world, you can access that. And then our personal blog is jakemahal.com. We're honestly not very good at blogging or updating anything. We prefer just to invite people to come and hang out and see how we live. But there are some bits on there of our self-sufficiency, our gardening, our eco stuff, our healthy living. And in the next couple of weeks, we'll be putting up something there that's all about whole life health, which is actually a new business that we're going to launch somewhere perhaps later this year, and kind of feed families into, so that they, you've got kids growing up, living life healthy, adults knowing how to navigate some of the food systems and health systems we find ourselves in today, which are largely failing us. So if that floats your boat, in a couple of weeks, there'll be an interesting post there about that.
Okay, so we live in a time where everyone's very aware of their financial situation, their ability to look after themselves. We get a lot of people messaging us for, I don't know why us. Well, I mean, we have this network, and so people want to hear from speakers addressing certain issues. So we might get people messaging about financial advice. We have people messaging about self-sustainability in terms of fruits and veg and growing their own stuff, so they're not completely dependent on other sources. And so we're thinking about people to have on to talk about this, and you are a name that came to mind, so we wanted to bring you on. Can you, to start this off, can you just talk to us about your background? How did you actually become interested in this? Have you always been interested in it? What was your back journey on this side of things?
Sure. So I grew up with my granddad gardening a lot. So grew up. I spent a lot of time at my grandparents' place, and there's a big fruit cage there with blueberries and raspberries and red currants, and he had rhubarb. He had various fruit trees and different shrubs, and then he was also, into kind of his geometry in the garden as well. So there were nicely shaped bushes and things. So I guess in some ways there was some influence there, but it wasn't ever really something that had taken hold early in life. And so my background actually, kind of academically, was theology and sports science. That's what I studied at university. So I've always been into kind of living healthy and what does it mean to steward our bodies really well. And I've always had this, I guess, a very holistic approach to spirituality, or however you want to term it. That God has given us these bodies, and I want to know how to steward it well. For the Hebrew mindset, there's not a distinction between the physical and spiritual. That they're all linked. We're a fully human person, and I guess from that perspective, there was always an acknowledgement of we need to be eating right and stewarding our bodies well. And what does that look like? And I think increasingly there's become an awareness globally, but I've become increasingly aware of just how destructive our current agricultural practices are, and partly because of the damage they're doing to our bodies with the pesticides that get sprayed on our food, because a lot of our food is overly fertilized with stuff that's not organic, and therefore they grow too well, and then you've got to put pesticides on because they attract pests, they attract funguses, so you put fungicide on, and then all of that stuff is going into our bodies and it's affecting our bodies. The relationship between glyphosate, which is used on most crops around the world now, and cancer is well established, and yet it continues to get sprayed. So I guess I had this journey of, oh my goodness, I need to start sourcing food in a better way. So we decided as a family we wanted to buy as much organic as we could, but we also decided we needed to grow as much as we could. And that's partly because we want to look after our bodies well, but it's also because we recognize that we're at a crucial point environmentally, and agriculture, the way that we're doing it now on big scales, is failing. We are going to run out of soil in 60 years, and part, I think, of the answer to that is small scale production of fruit and veg in your own backyard. And also the benefits of doing that are just huge. And because we've got this whole life health thing going on, we're aware of things like mental health. And Harvard published a study back in June or July showing just how good gardening in your own back garden is for your mental health. It's up there it is the best thing you can do for your mental health, seemingly. Gardening is joint with lots of things, but if you do it in your own back garden, for some reason that's even better for your own mental well-being. So there are just so many benefits to growing your own fruit and veg, and just this gradual transition where I think the seed was planted with my granddad. I spent a lot of time ignoring it, but then looking at the world situation, looking at our own health, it's like this is a large part of the answer.
Well, we've seen your back garden and it is impressive, really impressive. I mean, look at your back garden, it is holistic by nature.
Every inch is being used.
Yeah,
for this,
for physical and for gardening, and
that's true.
It's impressive. But I have to say, Jake, for someone like me, it's also overwhelming. I look out and I think, boy, I'd like to be like this. But
where was the first thing that you planted? What was the first thing you did?
What did you do? How do we even begin to get to that point? And I should imagine that most people who are listening are very much like us, looking out at their garden and saying, this is a great idea, but how do I start?
And some may have a garden which is all grass. Some may have a garden which is semi-grass, but they also have concrete. And so they're like, do I just plant in the grass? Do I do raised beds? I mean, what do I do here?
So can you take us on a journey from the moment we look out at our garden and say, we've been convicted by Jake. Now what?
I think the first thing is just do something. It almost doesn't matter what, but just go out, get your hands into the soil, or if you, like you say, if you haven't got soil, get some raised beds and start getting, maybe you buy some soil in, get a local delivery of some topsoil, and even if it's not the perfect start, just do something. So when we started, we started with a really disorganized system. There was no design to it. We built a gym out of scaffold, and as part of that, we wanted some boxes that you could jump on. And I thought, well, why not just fill these with soil and then make a lid so that when there's not a lid, we can grow stuff in there. And over time, they've kind of lost their function as boxes to jump on because the soil's become so important to us. But that's how we started. It was haphazard. We actually acquired some trough planters, and we thought, well, these are things about this deep, so there's not much soil to work with, but we thought, let's start growing some salad. And we did the traditional thing, I guess, of sowing rows of rocket, of spinach. We did some carrots in our raised beds, and I think the seeds initially we popped down to, it was either B&Q or Wilco's or somewhere like that, and we bought seeds from the shelf, which isn't something I do now, but at the time that's what got me on this journey. And I think
people not from England, those names are kind of like, garden centers or DIY places,
street shops. Wherever you can get some seed, just start. And the reason I say just start is because when you get your first crop, whether that be pulling a carrot out of the ground or whether that's seeing the first little, even if it's floral, not even something edible, but I noticed today that when I planted at my grandma's, the first little shoots of the tulips are coming up. And the wonder and awe that you have from that moment inspires you to do more and to read more. And I think, one of the beauties of the internet is there's so much information out there where you can learn. Sure, there's a lot of nonsense out there, but by and large, the community out there who are trying to grow things, you're hearing about someone's personal experience. It's something you can copy. It's something you can try something different. And there's so many resources out there that can help you. And that's really how I started. And what I'd suggest people do is just plant something in some soil somewhere. And the journey that had me on them was really learning how to look after soil really well. And another really fun thing that you can do is make compost. So that's another first thing you can do. So even if you don't even start with any soil, you can make some soil by getting your kitchen scraps, sticking them in a composter. We have a few different advanced types of compost system now, but to begin with, it was just chucking it all in a pile and letting the insects get in there, letting the worms get in there, and taking it out 18 months later, and you've got something that resembles soil that we can work with here. So they're two very simple things: is put a seed in the ground, see what happens, try a few different things, get inspired, and then start looking after soil, because that's a big issue in the world right now. So if you can compost, even if you're not going to grow anything, if you've got food scraps, make sure you compost them and you put them back into your garden. If you've got leaves on the road outside your house, or if you've got leaves on your drive, move to a bare patch of soil so that they degrade and go back into the soil rather than degrading on the side of the road and release their carbon into the atmosphere. Even if you're not going to grow anything, there are some simple little tricks and tips you can employ like that, just to help the bigger picture as well.
Yeah, I guess people think about this and they think the most important thing is what I'm taking and planting into the soil. But at the end of the day, if you don't have healthy soil, then the thing you're planting in it's not going to do anything anyway.
Yeah, and really that's why we find ourselves with the issue that we have, is we've tried to fertilize plants, and to do that we've just taken bulk mixes of nitrogen and potassium and phosphorus, stuck them on plants, but in doing so we've degraded the soil, because like I said at the start, the plants get too full of water, they get almost too good, to the point where they're not sustainable. They attract too many insects, they attract fungi. Then we have to treat them with other chemicals, which kills the bacteria in the soil. And just a spoonful of bacteria of soil, I think it's like 6 billion organisms in a tablespoon of soil, and that's what's doing the work for us, are these organisms in the soil. So we have to feed soils in order to produce good crops that are sustainable. And if you're a little further on, where you've taken your seed and you think, okay, I've seen something grow, I want to continue to do this, then start investing in learning some soil management. And there are some great resources out there. If you search for permaculture or no-dig gardening, they're two great philosophies of how to look after soil in a really simple, almost lazy way, but actually copies what you find in nature.
Well, I'll just backtrack on one thing you said and to affirm you. Like this last year, I bought some grow bags, and I think you were out here, and I thought, oh no, Jake is going to see my almost pathetic little
He's just going to laugh at us.
He's going to laugh at us. And you didn't. You encouraged me. But I tell you, the grow bags were too, they weren't deep enough for carrots, but I had put carrots in. So these carrots came out looking wonderfully weird shapes.
Little baby carrots.
But I was so proud of my carrots. I mean, I was like, oh, look, I didn't care that they were all crinkled and going in different directions, but I was really proud of my carrots, which is what you were saying about starting somewhere and you'll be thrilled. But can I just feed
and we did potatoes as well.
We
did slightly, the potatoes needed deeper soil, but we did those, and we did eat the potatoes.
Oh yeah, and we had a feast. We really knew we were eating our own potatoes. So
somehow they tasted a bit better knowing they were ours.
Yeah, they did. They really did. So I can relate to that. But can I just backtrack a minute and let's feedback from complete amateur. Have I understood you right? Compost. Tell us, define compost.
So compost is just the breakdown of organic matter into something which can be used to amend soil, something that can go into the soil to essentially add nutrients back into the soil. So your bare soil might be brick dust at the start from a non-agricultural site, from an ex-industrial site. It could be that you've got a heavy clay soil where there's just a lot of compacted clay. You might have sand. And what any of that needs in order to be a soil which can produce life is organic matter. It needs compost. And you can do this a number of ways. It can be gathering your stuff together. So your kitchen scraps, your manures, your grass clippings, your what you've pruned from the trees, that can all be put together, and microorganisms and fungi will break it down. Or you could do the lazy method and, whatever you're chopping off from pruning. I've been pruning some roses today, and I just used a method called chop and drop, where I just prune everything off and let it fall onto the soil, because that organic matter then is going to go back into the soil and essentially feed the soil. So composting can be done a number of different ways, but essentially you're taking living matter, allowing it to break down into something more simple that can feed the soil bacteria, and then essentially feed the plants, which are going to grow again and give you a useful crop. So what you've got is this cycle. And really in an organic system, the only major input is coming from the sun. It's coming from other renewable sources like water flows. You go to a forest and it hasn't needed a human to do anything, but it's self-sustained. And one of the best things you can do as somebody who's trying to plant, somebody who's trying to do some land management is sit and watch nature. There's a great Japanese proverb that says the best fertilizer for the garden is the shadow of the gardener. The more time you spend in the garden, the better your garden will be, because the more you will notice what's going on and the more you'll work with what's already happening. So in a natural system like a forest, you've got a small tree that's grown. It's captured carbon from the atmosphere. It's captured energy from the sun. It's got some nitrogen from the ground. It's produced this bigger and bigger thing. And then it starts dropping its leaves. And that carbon that's been captured from the atmosphere, plus nitrogen taken from the deep roots that have gone into the ground, that falls to the ground and becomes compost. It's just organic matter that's going back into the ground, and that then can feed another tree, another plant, wild garlic that's growing on the forest floor, which is a useful crop to humans. And really what the aspiration really, and you don't need to start here at all, but the aspiration is to have a system that with very little input will give you yields, because growing things like carrots and tomatoes is intensive, and you don't find annual crops like that in nature. They've been selectively bred, and I don't have any bones with that, because I love tomatoes, I love carrots, and if you want to grow those, great, go for it. But I also encourage people to look at what's happening in natural systems and see how far they can replicate that. I mean, you talked about our garden, and the back part of our garden is a food forest. So there are, I mean, it's a small garden, but there are probably 10 trees down there now. Some which are young productive trees, some which are shelter trees, some which are providing food for bees. And all of those are going to drop their leaves every year. And that back system, after probably the back end of this year, won't need too much input from us, which means we then got time to put into, our carrots and our raised beds and, those things that people would perhaps recognize more as, traditional gardening.
Well, it actually sounds like less work too. You haven't got to go around collecting up the leaves and collecting up the grass and everything. It's just let nature, as it were, take its course.
So build up the ecosystem, let it get self-sustaining, and then add the frills on top of that. Whatever. That's
it. I think, we want to recognize that we've been given this abundant world by God, and really we want to be doing some light management in that garden element. And beyond the garden, there's forest and there's these bigger systems, and we can make these creative and beautiful spaces for ourselves, but we don't want to be overly controlling. As soon as we start to control and manipulate and go, as a human, I'm going to be in charge of everything here, I think that's when we start losing our way. But when we're in tune with the kind of the natural rhythms that have been established by the Lord, ultimately, we can garden really well. And this is where modern agriculture is really letting us down, because we're really heavy-handed, and it's become all about us and ultimately about rampant consumption, and not thinking about giving back, into the soil, into the natural ecosystem, into the different animals that we need to be working with us. The more we copy nature, the less work it is for us. And I think the more in tune we are with what God's intention was for us, for our gardening and our production.
So we've got this, as it were. We're going to start saving our food scraps. We're going to let the leaves take their course and everything. And we have got some soil that we've been cultivating. Is that the word?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. We've got this soil that we've started doing it. Now what?
So you kind of got your first crops. You've been inspired. You've got your carrots or your tomatoes or whatever, and you've got some decent soil. And I think Andrew just said this. Actually, you're looking for a bigger ecosystem. You're looking for something larger. So you start trying to look for beneficial relationships. And this is.
I was going to say this when you were here with us and we were talking about your bags at the back of the garden. You're talking about the tree, and I thought about Avatar. For people that have seen the movie, you've got this big tree which is giving life to the things around it. And I was going to say, can you talk a bit about this, which is what you're going on to do? But yeah. I was thinking about Avatar and this tree giving life to others and creating a system around the bigger tree.
Yes. So carry on, Jake.
Yeah, because when you've got a grow bag with your tomatoes in, you've got quite an isolated system. It's only that big. But when you start thinking about the relationships between different elements of our life, you begin to piece things together and things start to become mutually beneficial. So if we were to start from a common place for us, which is the dinner table, you're there, you've got your food scraps and you're thinking, okay, from the food, I've got this from wherever, from the supermarket, I've grown it in my own back garden, and the output has been the food, and then that goes into me and that outputs in energy. But I've also got something left here, whether that's animal bones, whether it's an orange peel, banana peel, the ends of the carrots that you've cut off. You've not just got a leftover there, but you've got a resource. So you're learning to see everything as a potential resource, and those leftovers become your ingredients for your compost, but they also become the input potentially for your chickens. So there straight away, I've got two relationships are going on, and let's follow the trajectory of the chickens. Is I've given the food scraps to the chickens, and so that then becomes a resource for them. They eat it, and they then produce eggs for me. So there's a viable output, but also they've got manure, which is great again for my compost. So that's going back into my food production system. The chickens are also producing heat, which means that the area right around our geodesic dome that our chickens are in tends to be fairly frost free. So when we had -6 the other week, we had frost on our gym area in the back garden. We had frost creeping up the raised beds, but they didn't make it into the raised beds because if they're raised, they're slightly warmer and the cold air is going to sink. But right around where the chickens were, because the chickens are in there and they've been running around heating it all day, and because the geodesic dome is closed at the top, it kind of provided a pocket of warm air, which during the night seeps out and keeps the food forest more frost free. So then I've got another output from my chickens. So I've got another beneficial relationship. So they're keeping these areas frost free, which meant that we were able to grow nasturtiums right through into January. I don't know if you're familiar with nasturtiums. They're a climbing or trailing plant with nice flowers. They're edibles, nice and peppery, real easy to grow. If in fact, if you're completely new to gardening, get hold of some nasturtium seeds, because you can plant them in rubbish soil and they will grow really well. They look beautiful and they're edible. They're great for growing with kids. They're a really fun plant. But that meant they were able to go right through until just a couple of weeks ago, because they were situated next to the chicken. So again, beneficial relationship. The chicken then is providing me with eggs. So we're coming back to the dining table again. And from the chicken egg, I've got a load of calcium left over that can go into the oven. And it sits in the bottom of the oven. So when anything else gets cooked, the eggshells get baked. That can then go out onto the beds to provide the soil with calcium, which then provides me with better tomatoes or whatever my crop is. So there, hopefully that shows you how you can craft together these beneficial relationships. And that doesn't have to just be gardening. I mean, the beneficial relationship can be much wider than that in terms of the way you capture the sun, through having a south-facing aspect when you're designing houses, to get more light in, which is great for growing conditions, but also great for just heating your house. So it's learning to look at systems like this and go, how can I extend this? How can I make something here which might be a waste product in a conventional system? So the food might just go into the bin and then go to landfill, or the chicken poo, you might just dispose of that, whereas actually it can go back into the ground. So we're constantly trying to do what we'd call closing the loop. That's the permaculture term for it. So you never want to have an input one side, a process, and an output, but you want an input which feeds something else and just comes around into this loop. And sometimes you are going to need external inputs, and don't want to kind of say never do that, but you want to minimize that as much as possible.
When you talk about using chicken poo for composting and all that kind of stuff, and using now, does that work for any animal? Dogs, cats?
It
they might not have chickens, but a lot of people have cats and dogs.
Yeah, it depends on the conditions. So typically, because of the way that we've domesticated cats and dogs, their diets and their lifestyles mean that there's a lot of toxins in their waste. Now, chickens tend not to have that issue because they're not domesticated to the same degree that our kind of indoor pets are. So chicken manure is brilliant. And then cow manure, camel manure, duck manure, that kind of stuff's the more easily processed manure. Now, when you've got a manure that's got pathogens in, you can still use it. You just have to process it in the right way. So one of our compost systems in our back garden is a hot compost, where we've got an insulated bin, and dog waste does go in there from our dog. And because that's getting up to more than 40 degrees centigrade, I think half an hour is the recommended time. That's killing the pathogens that we don't want in there, but it's still allowing the beneficial bacteria to proliferate and give us good compost. So if you're doing hot composting, then human manure, dog manure, cat manure, that can all go through there. So even in that respect, you can close the loop. You just have to think a little bit and design into your system how you're going to do that in a safe way. And if you weren't growing just food produce, but you had a kind of wilderness area that was giving just back to nature that you were just going to let go, you could even just throw your kind of non-safe manures straight onto there and let nature do its thing, because you weren't going to be consuming anything directly from it in the next year or so. So even even the things that, we would say, that's a dirty material, actually it's still a resource.
Okay. Now, when we first started, the trees, I mean, you can't do anything about it, but I would probably think, oh, okay, well, I'm going to plant carrots. And then every year I'll just plant carrots. And when you were here talking to us, you were like, yeah, that's not ideal because it's taking the same nutrients and stuff out of the ground every year, but you need that to replenish. So can you talk a bit about that as well, about, rotating the things that you plant?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, crop rotation it's a well kind of founded thing. And actually you even see kind of biblical principles about resting fields and the way we use our crops and even fallow areas around the outside, which kind of create a bit of wilderness and social justice. Sorry, that's taking a completely different train of thought there. But yeah, so because you just take your carrot example, you're just taking year on year the nutrients that a carrot needs, which is going to be different to what a tomato needs, different to a sweet potato, and different to celery. So you're going to exhaust the soil. But also because a lot of, and particularly with annual crops, there are a lot of diseases that the carrot could get, and it could leave that in the soil, which would then be there ready for the carrot again next year. Whereas typically, say you follow your rotation from that carrot and then you go to let's say you go to a tomato, the tomato isn't likely to catch what the carrot has had. So you want to stay away from having the same sort of family in there. So if you've got, nightshade, for instance, tomato and what they call potatoes and strawberries, you can't follow those with each other because they are going to share pests, because strangely they're part of the same family. So you'd want to rotate to something else, and you can typically get away with a 3-year rotation, maybe 4-year rotation of moving from family to family. But again, this isn't the most beneficial way of agriculture or of gardening. So partly is planting in what you'd call a polyculture. So you've not just got carrots in one bed, but you've got some carrots, you've got some celery, you've got some, and particularly with carrots, to keep the carrot fly away, you might want to plant something in the onion and garlic family. So there's a mutually beneficial relationship there. But even to move beyond that, and this is what a large part of our system is now devoted to, we've only got 3 beds now where we're growing annuals. Everything else we're growing perennials, and that is something that doesn't just be in the soil for 1 year, but it's going to be there for year after year. And it could be a short-lived perennial where it has 3-4 years, and then obviously you've got trees, which are perennials potentially up for 600 years. If you start thinking about oaks, and there are a myriad of benefits to growing what's called a perennial vegetable or perennial crop, because they're going to put down deeper, more established roots, which hold soil in. So, when we have extreme weather events, we lose so much topsoil because we've got loads of fields planted with annuals and they don't have roots that are permanently in the soil, anchoring soil together. Whereas when you have long established crops, then you're able to better anchor soils. Also, you get better nutrients. The thing is, we're not familiar these days so much with perennial crops. So in our garden right now, we've got something called Good King Henry, which is a bit like a spinach. It's something that used to get used in the UK all the time, but you won't find it on any supermarket shelves now. But rather than something that has to be replanted every year, it's in the ground, and it'll be in the ground for 5-6 years. And it'll continue to add nutrients to the ground. When it breaks down, once it's gone, it's going to anchor ground in, and it's going to start to form beneficial relationships with other plants. So just like with the carrot and the onion, only it's got a much longer relationship with other plants in the garden. And just like with the human relationship, the more time they have together, the better they learn to work together. Exactly the same in the garden. So we've got a load of plants in our food forest. We've got lovage growing, Good King Henry, full strawberry, alpine strawberry. We've got some clovers. We've got some different mints. We've got a few different fruit trees. We've got gooseberry, raspberry, and all of those are going to be there for a decent amount of time. When we first planted them last year, we did also have extra space because they were all real small. So we planted some tomatoes and things in the gaps. Now the perennials are starting to take over. And this is what you'd see in a natural system, is you'd see a short-lived thing fill what's called a niche before a bigger plant took over. So if you leave land here in Britain, eventually you will get forests. That's the natural succession in our temperate climate. That is different in the tropics, it's different in the desert. So that's how here we would, I've actually forgotten what your initial question was now. I've kind of gone off on a massive tangent.
The big tree feeding it.
Yeah. So we've gone through this kind of principle of succession where we've gone with the smaller stuff, and because that's given us a quick return. But then we've got this bigger system that's growing all the time, and within that we can still design elements to give us the crops that we want, the annuals that we find tasty. But at the same time, we've got to start growing some of the things that we've moved away from, because you can't intensively farm things like Good King Henry or lovage to the same degree that you can a sweet corn, a carrot, wheat, corn, and those kind of things. But the benefit to eating from a system like this as well is that it's so good for our bodies. We're not needing to use pesticides, because typically pests aren't attracted in the same way to the plants that grow in the big system. They don't have as, snails and slugs aren't as interested in those plants because they're not as big and as juicy. But also because you've got this more biologically diverse system, you're also attracting the predators of the pests. So because we've got a bigger diverse system where, say you've got a pond, the pond will be able to introduce frogs, which will eat your slugs, or say you've got ducks, they're going to eat your slugs. If you've got things like voles or gophers that are eating your ground cover crops, then eventually you're going to get an owl which is going to come and start taking those out. You start attracting a bigger system which will self-manage. And a lot of permaculturists say that within 7 years you should have a system that can manage itself effectively. And you can speed that up if your system is not going to be as big, but that's kind of massive farm scale. So you've got this bigger system, and with that big system you need less crop rotation. Sure, there's still a little bit of management here and there, but for a food forest system, actually you can get away with about 2 hours input a month once it's established, and then just take your food from it. There's here in the UK, there's a great place down in Devon, the Dartington Estate, which is where the Agroforestry Research Trust is based. If you have a quick Google and put in Agroforestry Research Trust food forest, the National Geographic did a quick 3-4 minute video on this place, and it's stunning. So food forests really are kind of the place to aim for in the long run, both for food production, but also in terms of locking up carbon and looking after the planet. A lot of people would say that we need to be aiming for 70% forest cover in our agricultural systems, which is not what we have at the moment. When you look over the feedlots that cows are kept in, or the soy production that's taken over the Amazon, it's not sustainable, and it needs to change. But we can change that in our own backyard as well.
Well, so you've been talking about forests. Can we move on to trees?
Yeah.
Trees, plum trees, pear trees.
Forests are made up of trees.
Yeah, but I'm talking about back garden trees,
Okay,
right?
fine.
We're not going to plant a forest. Well, not most. So here we are. We plant a tree. Is that it? I mean, from our own experience, right? I will tell you about our own experience, things I said at the beginning and know nothing. We planted apple, pear, plum,
Great.
and
Cherries.
Yep.
Well, year one, we did wonderfully. Year two or so, there were less. The next year were even less fruit. And now we're wondering, why did we plant all these trees when it seems to us that the fruit are gradually...
The pear tree, pear tree is pretty consistent. The pear tree gives a lot of pears most years. The cherries...
We went away, didn't we? And when we came back, the birds had had
the cherries, the birds love. And so
they disappeared.
It's a race, us against the birds for the cherries. And at the minute, the birds are winning, hands down, wiping the floor of us.
But the apples, they kind of not...
The apples have slowed down fairly significantly.
So here we are, like, we thought plant a tree and we're good for life. So come on, tell us, Jake, what have we done wrong?
There are a number of factors with trees that could be affecting what you've done. I mean, typically, in my experience and from what I've read, if you get the right trees in the first place for where you are, they're not going to need a whole lot of attention. So a lot of our fruit trees that we can buy now, so if I were to go down to my local supermarket, for instance, they have trees on sale at the front, and they are typically dwarf trees or semi-dwarf trees. So they've been grafted onto a different root system to keep the tree small, manageable, and to get it to fruit earlier than a normal tree. So if you just have an apple tree on its own rootstock, it might not bear any fruit for the first 5-6 years, and then it's going to get really tall, right up to 20 meters or whatever, and you're going to struggle to get up and get your fruit from it. So a lot of people are growing on rootstocks, which intentionally give some characteristics to a tree. So I don't know where you bought yours from, but if it was kind of from a local supermarket or somewhere like that, my imagination is they're going to be those kind of trees that are grown on dwarf rootstocks.
No, a garden centre.
Although one of the apple trees we got is a dwarf tree.
Although one is a dwarf tree, yeah.
Yeah. So, but even the ones from the garden centres, they're going to have special characteristics which they've been selected for, and most trees are going to prefer a certain soil type, and they're also going to want to have not a lot of competition around them in their early years. So there are a number of factors with trees. Now, if you plant a vigorous fruit tree on its own rootstock, if it takes, odds are it's going to do well in most soils. But there's always going to be competition. So if you've planted them too close together, you might have one that's established its roots better and is going to do better at taking the nutrients out of the soil, so that your other tree isn't going to get it. So that may be a reason it's not doing too well. But I mean, it sounds like your cherry tree and your pear tree are doing well. So it sounds like overall your soil's probably good for fruit production. It could be that the apple's just lost out a little bit, but also, have you cared for your soil? Have you mulched around your tree with some organic matter, with some compost? If you've just planted into grass, then quite early trees when they're young can struggle because of the competition from the grass. Also, because as they get a bit older, if you've got a lot of nitrogen around, so say if you've got clovers in your grass, while they can be good for the trees starting to grow, in terms of fruit production, having too much nitrogen is going to hold the fruit production back. What it actually needs is more it's either potassium or phosphorus, one of the two, that it needs for its fruit production rather than nitrogen. So just a little bit of tree maintenance is probably what is needed. So actually feeding the soil around it. And if you're at the stage, not where you are, but if you're thinking about trees, it's well worth looking at what sort of tree you want to get, how long you want it to fruit for, how tall you want it to be, and also whether it's going to suit your soil type. Because if you've got a heavy clay soil that's not been well managed, it may well have become acidic lower down because there may be a compaction layer, and then there's anaerobic activity where oxygen can't get to lower down. And a lot of people would recommend taking a soil type analysis, where some local councils will do that for you, where you can send off your soil, or you could just Google who can send me a kit to get a soil analysis. They're relatively inexpensive, and they can save you some headaches along the line. If you've got a kind of a middle of the line soil where it's not massive clumps of clay, it's not falling through your hands because it's made mainly of sand. If it's somewhere in the middle of those two, it's a healthy looking dark colored loam, stick a tree in, see what happens. Especially if you've got a young tree, you're not going to have spent much from it. You can even take a cutting from somebody else's tree. If you've got a neighbor who's got a tree you like, if you look up on the internet how to take a cutting, cultivate it for 2 years in a pot, keep it in sheltered conditions because that's where it's really vulnerable. Stick it in the ground and see what happens. So much of any gardening is about observation and just seeing what does well and what doesn't do well. Yeah, you can set yourself up really well by doing a soil analysis, getting a design all laid out. But trees are fairly robust. And, there are some trees that are bred specifically to do well in any soil. If you're really interested, in a kind of comprehensive list of trees, then getting one of the kind of designer's manuals, like how to grow a forest garden or growing a forest garden. Books like that are great in terms of just giving you the details of going, this is a good tree that will do well pretty much anywhere, stick it in the ground and leave it. Little maintenance required.
Okay, well, I said we were going back to real basics. Before we finish, I've got another really basic question. So most gardens, certainly in the UK, and I know it's different around the world, the big component is grass. Right?
Yeah.
There's grass. Now, I'm looking out and I say, okay, I want to move into what Jake's saying. I really understand the value. I really want to go there. But I'm looking at this grass. Do we go and dig it all up? Do we use it? I mean, what do you do when you're starting from grass?
Yeah. So the simplest way to turn grass into a productive bed is to get some food scraps, some food waste. Now, if you don't have enough to kind of create an inch thick layer, the size of a garden bed you want, then go to a restaurant, go to anywhere that's got a large kitchen, a conference center, something like that, and say, do you have any food scraps, so that you can create an inch or two depth of food scraps. And this could be something that's 1 meter by 2 meters. You know, this is a good way to get started. Lay it on the grass, and then get some manure. If you've got horse stables are really generous with their manure. Freya and Tilda at the moment have just popped down to the stables to get some manure from there for a little project we've got going on, not in our back garden, but in my grandparents' back garden. You can get other manures, of course, as well. But if you're living in the city, generally on the outskirts of the city somewhere, there'll be somebody who's riding horses. If you're living in a kind of temperate climate, so, you know, if you're North America, Canada, right across Europe, you'll find people keeping horses. But whatever manure you can get your hands on, get it, stick that down on top of your peelings, your food scraps. And again, you're looking for kind of 2 or 3 inches. And then you're going to soak a load of cardboard. So any cardboard boxes you get, save them for a while, or go to a supermarket where you can get boxes. Make sure you remove any tape, any labels, anything like that. These days, you don't have to worry about the ink or anything like that on there, because they're typically vegetable dyes. And then you want to soak them. Once you've soaked them, put them on top of what you've already created with your food scraps and your manure. And the cardboard is going to create a barrier for any weeds that are going to try and come up, or the grass underneath, to make sure that can't come through. And then on top of that, you're going to put a mulch material, is what you'd call it. And this could be straw. Hay's not great, because again, you're going to get grass seeds in there, but straw typically is quite good. It could be really fine wood chip. It could be bedding from any animals where, you know, it's still got a bit of manure mixed in. And any high carbon material. So again, it could even be shredded cardboard if you've got access to shredded cardboard rather than sheets of cardboard. And you're going to pile it up 3 inches. So then you've got a kind of layer like this on top of the grass. And now what you're going to do is you're going to grab any seedlings you've got. So say you've got a little tomato plant that you bought in a pot, or you've put a seed in and you've seen it grow and you've nurtured it on your windowsill. You're then going to take it out, make a little hole in that top layer that's on top of the cardboard, fill that with some soil. And it doesn't have to be compost. It can be compost, but it could just be soil that you found, you've dug out from underneath the lawn or whatever. Put that into the hole and put your seedling in there. Now, this seems daft, because you're thinking, well, there isn't any soil there. There's just a load of materials that seem like nothing. But what you're doing is you're just composting right on top of the grass. And it means you haven't got to do any grass clearance, because if you want to remove all the grass and cultivate that whole area, it's a lot of work. Getting grass up is difficult. But if you can kill the grass by layering it over, then the grass dies, but it dies back into the ground. So all the nutrients that the grass has accumulated over the years, that's going to be there. And eventually your plants are going to be able to access that. The cardboard is going to break down over time. Worms are going to come up to the surface to get into the manure and the food scraps. But corrugated cardboard particularly makes like little, it's kind of got the little grooves in. That's great nesting for the worms. So they're going to come up, they're going to make little nests in there. They're going to start breaking down the manure, they're going to start breaking down the food scraps, and that's then going to become available to the tomato that you've put in there, or the courgette that you've put in there. So that's a real simple way to make a very quick raised bed. You could, of course, buy yourself that's not even raised. I mean, that's just kind of on the ground, and it will just mulch down, and you can repeat that around. You may want to put a board around it so that you define it a little bit, and you can then start building up the organic layers, and you can repeat that process every year to start building the soil and start feeding it. That's a real simple way to start. But say, I didn't answer this question when you asked at the start, actually. If you've got a concrete yard, then you can do exactly the same, but build it in a raised bed. So first you want to get a lot of soil, and because you're putting the organic matter on top, it doesn't matter where the soil's from almost. I mean, yeah, you don't want to get diseased soil, but the length you'd have to go to find out what condition the soil is in, you may as well just try it and see if it works, especially if you're putting in some tomato seedlings or something and your investment isn't large. You've not forked out a lot of money for it. Just give it a go. Make yourself a raised bed on top of your concrete, stick some soil in, get organic matter on top, that process that I've just explained, repeat it on top of the soil you've put in, and you're good to go. You can do the same in a container pot. Again, just organic matter on the top. If you've got access to already composted material, great, just go ahead and stick that on as well. The great thing about already composted material, if it's fully composted, you can just stick it straight on top of your soil and straight around the plant, and you don't need to worry about building up the layers. But it really is simple. There aren't too many things that could go wrong with that system, because you're just working with nature, you're letting the compost do its thing, and ultimately you're just starting out. If you get a small crop your first year, you're going to learn something along the way, and you can improve it the next year.
And I guess one last question for people that are going to do the raised beds. Different things need different depths. I guess potatoes may be ones that need more than others, but is there sort of a generic height that if you get a raised bed this deep, you're pretty good for most things?
Yeah, so unless you're growing root vegetables, then 6 to 12 inches is great. Ultimately, the deeper you go, the more variety in the future you can grow in there. Especially if you want to start rotating your crops and you want to have root vegetables, say you want to start growing sweet potatoes, or you want to grow parsnips, then the deeper the better. I mean, we've had parsnips that are kind of 3 foot long. So the deeper you go, the more scope you've got to do different adventurous things. But if you're only growing things above the surface, you can get away with 6 inches of kind of nutritious soil. If you're growing salad crops, then you only need a couple of inches of soil to get a decent salad crop. I mean, people are growing salad crops in gutters now with aquaponic systems where they're not even using soil. But that's something quite complex. But yeah, you don't need a huge amount of depth. But my recommendation is, if you can use more depth, go for more depth. And if you can at all actually link, whether you've got a raised bed or not, if you can link it to the subsoil that's already there, the grass that's already there, the kind of organic stuff that's down in the ground already, do that, because long term you're going to benefit. And you'll find some species that pull those nutrients up to the surface as well. So especially if you're going for a forest system, you're going to plant some things intentionally, like some comfreys and like some sorrels, that are going to pull nutrients up to the surface for you.
Great. I think that is a good start for people. I think we've given a lot of information for them to think about, some basics.
Let's go head to the garden.
Steps. I'm not going now, it's too cold. But thank you, Jake, for taking the time. I know that there's been a lot of interest in this, so we wanted to get you on as we could to talk about it. And hopefully this will inspire people to be able to take, like you said, just take a step, just do something, and be inspired by what you do as you see it grow. And hopefully it will go from there. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Jake.
Yeah, pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If it inspired you, please rate us and subscribe on Apple or Google Podcasts, Spotify, or another podcast platform.